Yeah, let's do this. So I will start by, I'm going to share my screen. I've got a slideshow for you. And just to add to Mary's encouragement / warning, I would also say that I might not just ask questions at the end. I might provide an opportunity for us to discuss and share some reflections and questions in the middle too. So be ready for that. Here is my slides. Hopefully they show up okay. Can people see that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes.
Terrific. So start close to home. This is yesterday here in Kingston, Ontario. And I thank Mary for that land acknowledgement. It is very appropriate when we consider the topic of climate justice, which we'll get into a little further down the road. I think it's interesting in terms of the rally yesterday that when we had all these young people out, people of all ages, as the Whig Standard points out, but the leaders of this protest yesterday were young people, were Queen students that worked with 350 to stage an amazing climate protest as part of 350 Canada's actions that were held across the country in dozens of communities in Canada ahead of the leaders' debate last night, calling on our candidates for high office to not only reduce emissions and move away from fossil fuels, but call for climate justice. So what do they mean? Why is climate justice a worthwhile aim, and what does it ask of us? These are some of the questions I'm going to explore this evening. And I would just like to point out that the organizers here in Kingston are working in a tradition of young activists of diverse backgrounds all over the world who are also raising the same call for climate justice. So I'll speak a little bit about myself, just because my reflections on climate justice necessarily come from my own perspective. And, I am a person of privilege. I have not been subjected to very much injustice in my life. I'm a white, straight, middle-class person. I'm someone who, by virtue of my background and my wealth and where I live, is insulated from the worst aspects of the climate crisis. I am also a person who comes from a community of great environmental violence. I'm from Peterborough, Ontario. Where General Electric operated its main Canadian operations for over 100 years. And it's the toxic impacts of its legacy have affected people throughout my community and our land and waters. This is a still from the documentary Town of Widows, which talks about the occupational cancer that GE workers experience due to their environmental exposures on the job. To give you a little bit more about me and where I come from, I'm also a historian. And so I actually came to climate activism after years of studying capitalism and political and social movements. So that's been a really big influence on how I see the climate crisis and how I see climate justice. Is I came to it through looking at what social movements have worked, what social movements haven't, and why. Why does historical change happen at some moments and not happen at other moments? What are the specific factors in a capitalist system that tend to produce the climate crisis? So all of those are big influences on my perspective where I come from. I've lived in Kingston since 2015. And most relevantly for our conversation this evening, I am a climate justice organizer with the Sisters of Providence. There's a picture of Bridget Doherty, who is a former Green Group member and my colleague at the Sisters. So many of you know Bridget. And when I was hired and in the last 18 months, since I've been fortunate enough to have had the responsibility of leading the Sisters mission on environmental issues and climate change, I have brought a climate justice focus to the work. So what does that mean? We'll start with definitions, and I could give you a Google definition or an Oxford English dictionary, but there are many ways to define climate justice. And I told you I was going to ask the question, so I'll give you my definition. This is brief, but if anybody wants the slides, I'm happy to share them with anybody later for your own use. But basically, my definition of climate justice is the climate crisis was created by injustice. Its impacts and risks are distributed unjustly across the globe and within populations. And therefore, our response to the climate crisis must, not should, must simultaneously take on inequality of wealth as well as gender, racism, and colonialism as we reduce emissions and transition away from fossil fuels. And don't worry, we are going to get into that and explore what that means a little bit more over the next few minutes. Obviously, we all know that the climate crisis is already here. It is not now something that we need to worry about for the future. We are out of time. We are not out of time to mitigate the worst effects of the climate crisis or to transition away in a way that will avoid total catastrophe. But we are out of time in terms of avoiding some catastrophic impacts. And this is still from a photo of Hurricane Ida, which hit the Gulf Coast and up the eastern seaboard and obviously killed many people in New York City just last week. And these types of hurricanes and severe storm events, as we all know, are being exacerbated. They're worse and they're more frequent because of climate change. And they're also an example of injustice, right? It's interesting, just coming to me now as I think about it, there's a tendency to refer to traditionally for centuries, things like hurricanes as acts of God. And what that meant was that it was beyond human control and that it could happen to anyone at any time. But we live in what scientists now call the Anthropocene, in which human activity is the biggest factor determining the climate. So hurricanes like this are now in many ways acts of man, and they do not impact everybody the same way. Much like COVID, where we were all in the same storm, but some of us had super tankers and some of us had dinghies and some of us had an inner tube. So it is that the injustice of environmental landscape is highlighted by events like this. So you can probably see the petrochemical plants in the background of the downed power lines here. This is an area of Louisiana that is called Cancer Alley. That is the home to 150 fossil fuel and petrochemical facilities. So this area has been on the front lines of the fossil fuel economy for many decades. And it wasn't just climate change that impacted these people. People in this area breathe dirty air and they experience things like cancer and other issues far more frequently than other areas of the country. Similarly to the Chemical Valley in and around Sarnia, Ontario, which especially affects Indigenous peoples that live there with higher rates of things like birth defects and cancers and stuff like that. And now, because of their location, they are uniquely vulnerable to these storms and to the demolition to petrochemical facilities when they happen. This is Sharon Levine here, who is one of the foremost environmental justice organizers in the United States. She, as of a couple of days ago, was still without power because her community, despite living in the midst of these petrochemical facilities that produce so much wealth for their owners, does not have adequate resilience, does not have adequate wealth to keep the power on, and have enough generators when a storm like this happens. She pointed out in the interview I heard with her on the radio this morning that the petrochemical facilities, of course, all have generators and they're still running. So the climate crisis is not equally distributed. People are feeling it in different ways and it hurts people more than others. And similarly, the causes of the climate crisis are not equal. Let's take a look at, these are, I think this is 2021. These are the estimates of the people who are individually most responsible for CO2 emissions on the planet. So if you can see, this is, I believe, tons of CO2 emissions. Roman Abramovich, just yachts alone is a staggering amount of emissions. And there's definitely some familiar names on here, David Geffen, and Kroenke from the Waltons family, the Walmart empire, some of the Google folks, Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Michael
Bill
Bloomberg,
Gates.
Bill Gates.
Yeah.
So these folks produce far more emissions than everyday people. And they're also far more equipped to be okay when the storm comes. This is a picture of a luxury super bunker that the ultra wealthy are building to ride out the worst impacts of the climate crisis. This one looks really nice. That actually looks like a window, but it's not, because it is a bunker that is a simulated like virtual reality window outside to a beautiful garden. But the pool, I think, is very real. Yeah, looks spectacular, but most of us are not going to have this to draw back on in the event of a climate crisis. Similarly, as we know, in terms of the global picture, countries like Canada, who I believe is the per capita single largest energy user in the world, the United States, the United Kingdom, countries like these bear an outsized responsibility for CO2 emissions. And we also have also benefited the most from the fossil fuel economy of the past 150 years. We have by far the most wealth. And it's not just because we are lucky, it is through processes like colonialism that have extracted wealth from the global south and transferred it to corporations and wealthy people in our area. So globally, the climate crisis is the product of inequality. We have differing responsibilities. And even within wealthy countries like Canada and the United States, some individuals are using an awful lot of CO2 and benefiting an awful lot. And some individuals are not producing a lot of CO2. And this isn't just an issue of fairness. Because we all, if my dad was here, he would have yelled, "Life isn't fair" at me 10 minutes ago, and we'd all be done, right? And you guys could go watch the Jays game if it's on. I'm not sure if they're playing tonight. It's actually, if we're interested in solving the climate crisis, we have to come to terms with this fact. Because I'm sure most of you on this call already know that we do not need to invent fantastic new technologies to solve the climate crisis. We already have basically what we need to draw down emissions and transition away. And anyways, we don't have time to invent stuff, scale it, and deploy it at the time that we need to the next 10 years to forestall the most horrifying consequences. So if we have the things that we need to solve the climate crisis, and people around the world are already suffering, and people around the world are extremely concerned about the future, why haven't we done more? Well, what I'm arguing today is that this inequality that I'm talking about, the concentrated wealth and power in the hands of a few, is not just unjust. It's not only unfair. It is the single largest obstacle we face to addressing the climate emergency. Because for most folks, the dozens of people, and it's only a few dozen at the very, very top of the scale, the current economy works extremely well for them, and they're extremely loath to changing it. And these people are the same folks who have the most influence over our governments, our economy, and our media. And this power and wealth must be confronted if we are to move forward. Not just me talking about this, is a recent article by Bruce Campbell. Climate crisis and wealth inequality are joined at the hip. And I have to think that he is right. So that gives you a bit of an understanding, hopefully, of climate justice and climate injustice. The scale of the problem is because of global injustice, and therefore, I believe that a focus on justice at home and abroad is necessary. But it's not just logical to focus on climate justice. Climate justice is also an ethical response to our times. I think as human beings who feel, we know instinctively that if people bear different responsibilities for a problem, they bear different responsibility for the solution. And I think we all know that it is monstrous to let refugees from the world's poorest nations suffer and die rather than lead solutions right here in the rich and privileged West.
I do too.
It is also resonant with what the Bible asks of us. There are a few different quotes here. I think the one most resonant with our discussion about wealth and how the materialist pursuits of some are obstacles to the changes we need. But woe to you, Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and every herb and neglect justice and the love of God. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. So I work in a Roman Catholic space with the Sisters of Providence. And one thing that I'm extremely grateful for in that space is that Pope Francis has been perhaps the most prominent global voice for a climate justice approach. Probably Greta's passed him by now. But I think he's maybe the most prominent person who was already in a position of great power, who chose to use that power to talking about climate justice. And Laudato Si, his encyclical, his major statement as pontiff so far, he calls on all people of good faith to answer the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor simultaneously. Doesn't say do one and then the other. His reasoning is that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach because everything is interconnected. But also because, like myself, he roots the seed of the climate crisis and ecological degradation and extinction problem in an economic and social system that leads us to treat each other as disposable. And so naturally, it leads us to treat creation as disposable. He points out at one part of Laudato Si the sobering question that the New Zealand bishops put to him that asked what the meaning of the commandment thou shalt not kill is when 20% of the population consumes resources at a rate that robs the poor nations and future generations of what they need to survive. So I want to take a moment here to pause and sit with that, because that is, I think, what we've covered in the past little while is relatively heavy, and I want to create a little bit of space for that. I'm going to turn my screen off. You're welcome to do so too. And I'm just going to do some box breathing and invite you all to take a few minutes just to take a break. And box breathing is great. It's just picture making a box in your head. Breathe in for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, breathe out for 4 seconds, hold for 4 seconds, and repeat. So we'll try a few cycles of that. The instructions are up here on the slide. And in a couple minutes, we'll come back and there will be an opportunity for some reflection and questions on what we've covered so far. Okay, I'll just give those of you who are trying that out a couple minutes to complete cycle of breath. And right now, before we go into the final section of the talk I prepared this evening, I just want to, well, first of all, mention, that I'm very aware of the kind of like the psychological impacts of thinking through climate change and climate crisis and climate justice. So starting next week with the Kingston Frontenac Public Library, we're starting a 6-session climate feeling circle where people have an opportunity to gather at Central Branch on Thursday afternoons every 3 weeks to discuss just emotional responses, spiritual responses to living through this, kind of unprecedented global climate crisis and climate emergency, and it's a circle for support and exploration of what it means to live and thrive and respond to these times. So I think that's up on the Kingston Frontenac Public Library website now. So registration is available if anybody's interested in doing that. So I just want to open a little space right now if anybody has any questions or comments or reflections on what we discussed so far.
I have a comment. Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, good. I was experiencing many feelings and thoughts as I was going through this box breathing that you just gave us, thinking about the injustices and people who don't have the clean air that we have to breathe in here. Thinking of people who are out west during the fires and not being able to breathe outside because of the particles in the air and the heat. I was thinking about the boxes of cereal from the GM building and the cancer-causing chemicals that they inhaled during that. And I was just thinking how fortunate I am to have this air that I have in my midst to breathe. And hopefully it's not being too damaging to my body. An interesting experience. So thank you.
Thank you, Valerie. And yeah, I mean, clean air is a huge environmental justice issue. Like a good friend of mine, who's also a historian, wrote his PhD thesis on people who live near the Wayne County incinerator, which is a garbage incinerator in Detroit, and some of the breathing issues that people have had through there. And it's also an issue of progress. I mean, smog and air pollution and stuff are things that environmental activists did make, major progress over the last several decades. So it is also an example of victories that we can have.
Thank you, Val. There is a question in the chat from Mary Radden. Has there been a time in history when there was such a focus on justice?
I mean, I would say.
Asking a historian.
Yeah, no, yeah, for sure. I mean, I open myself up for this. It's a really good question. I would say there are always struggles for justice happening historically, right? I mean, if we look over the last several decades, we see struggles of equality, for gay and lesbian and trans people, for women, struggles for racial justice and indigenous rights. I mean, these are things that come and go, but they come and go in terms of how much attention there is. So your word focus is appropriate, but there are always people struggling in these areas to create a more just world. And you think back to, and one of my favorite analogies for hope in the climate crisis is thinking about the mid-19th century. And as a historian, I've taught some courses on the U.S. and Canada in the 18th and 19th century. And if you read stuff from like major newspapers in the U.S. in 1858, 1859, 1860, the line they give you on slavery is, Well, yes, we know that slavery, most right-thinking people know that slavery is horrible and, an affront to God and blah, blah, blah. But like, the whole economy is based on it. We're not going to get rid of slavery overnight. Like, maybe in 50 years if things change. And, within a decade, the slave system in the United States have been destroyed in one of the biggest transfers of power and freedom in the history of North America. So these changes, even of things that, seem to be fundamental to our economy and the way we do things, they do happen. Struggles for justice, I think, are always there, but there are different moments where there's more of a focus. I honestly currently think that the racial justice and the climate justice struggles of the past couple years, in addition to the COVID pandemic and what it has revealed, not only about the broader injustice in our society, but also our ability to completely change things to respond to a crisis, has meant that we are in a time of intense justice focus, but certainly not an unprecedented one, I don't think.
That was a great answer, Jeremy. Let me see if there's any other chats in here. No, but I was thinking about the magnitude of change. Like, how do we as individuals, affect, going to a rally, but, as consumers, like, I think that we are the product. We're the product in all this social media and all the world exists now, consumerism. Is there something that we collectively can do or individually can do?
Yes.
With a focus on justice.
Absolutely, I believe so, and I really like that you and that we are going to get into that. So maybe that's a good transition for me to get back into my prepared part of my talk. But I would say that you've hit on something really important, that our economy approaches us as a consumer and as also a product, and we're encouraged to think that way. I'm not here to embrace or denigrate any party slogan. And anyways, this was about the last election, not this one. In the previous election, the Conservative Party slogan was, "It's time for you to get ahead," right? And that's a very consumerist approach to politics. Like, what's in it for me? What am I getting? And for me, I saw that and I was like, ahead of who? Aren't we all supposed to be living in the same country? That doesn't seem like a great model. But we are, that is a big weight. But it's interesting, people act outside of that consumer or product identity constantly all the time. We do with our relatives, their friends, with their children. We do it in groups like this, that, where we come together. We do it in church and other spaces of worship. And these are, I would argue, most of the most important and fulfilling moments and relationships of our life. And so I just want to kind of light that as a bit of a candle that hopefully will guide us as we get through the rest of what I've prepared to talk, and hopefully we could pick that up again a bit in our second kind of Q&A session. Nice. So I've spoken about the causes of the climate crisis being injustice, therefore demanding a justice approach. And I've also spoken about my belief that ethics and morality call us towards a climate justice response to this emergency. Next, I'm going to talk about why I also think it's our best strategic choice, and also why it is our best choice for the kind of world that we want to live in. So there are certainly people in the climate field. I don't know if any of you have heard of Mark Jacquard at Simon Fraser University. He recently made headlines again with his review of the party's climate policy, who are skeptical to hostile to a climate justice approach. Their argument, and it's a good one on its face, is climate policy is really hard. It's hard to get support for climate action. Incorporating all these other things is just too complex, it's too much, it's too big, and we won't be able to do it. But as a historian, I'm inclined to disagree, in part by my reading of the history of the environmental movement. And I want to say this is a history of what we would refer to as the mainstream or the prominent environmental movement. As Mary pointed out in the land acknowledgement, while not identified or maybe not self-identifying as environmentalists, Indigenous peoples have done most of the land protection and water protection and stewardship on these lands for thousands of years and continue to be land defenders. Working class people, although not often considered part of the environmental movement, demonstrate an enormous amount of care and connection with the environment. Farmers and rural people, also generally not included, but these are all people who have been environmentalists in Canada's history. But when we talk about the Canadian environmental movement, we're generally talking about middle and upper class professional people who are attracted to environmental politics and conservation. And this group, this movement has had enormous victories. And I want to honor those victories before I start to criticize. Because victories, as I know as an organizer, are really hard, and I'm really grateful for anybody who won them. So for example, the acid rain crisis that I grew up with as a kid, when we worried that all the trees would be gone, or at least all the leaves in the trees, and no animals would be able to live in the forest anymore, no birds. Acid rain was stopped, right? Recently, this week, there was a discussion of the fact that, do you remember the Montreal Protocol? Remember that agreement on CFCs in the early 90s? That actually worked, and it actually reduced a lot of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And one of the reasons that we still have a shot was because the Montreal Protocol happened. And those kinds of things, and things like species protection from people like Greenpeace, anti-nuclear waste activism, all massive victories of the early environmental movement. But we must learn from those victories, and we must also learn from their struggles. They focused on conservation of a pristine wilderness versus environmental harms. This environmental movement was very good at connecting with policymakers. They were less good at building a broader constituency beyond people who were already part of the group. And they certainly struggled to build alliances with workers and Indigenous peoples. And often, unfortunately, and we've all seen this dynamic, they were pitted against groups that should have been their natural allies. For example, the classic workers versus environmentalists thing that happens anytime that there is a logging controversy, right? But if you actually look more deeply into a lot of people who do logging for a living, those people are people who live in wilderness communities. They live in the forest. They care deeply about maintaining the forest for future generations. They have a lot in common with environmentalists. But because those links weren't there, it became easy for people who benefited from logging, your McMillan, Blodells, et cetera, to turn middle-class environmentalists versus working-class loggers. And also, unfortunately, sometimes these environmentalists replicated colonialism in claiming to know more about how to treat the land and how to live on the land than Indigenous peoples, and not always being the best listeners or allies. So we need the lessons and the victories and the conservation spirit of the environmental movement, but we also need to do so in a way that makes it bigger and stronger, because we need basically as many people to be part of environmental politics as possible. That means we need a justice approach. For one thing, we have so much to learn and so much to honor from what Indigenous nations and peoples have done in this continent to not only steward lands and waters, but also in terms of climate activism. I don't know if any of you saw the report that came out last week, but that said that Indigenous resistance has directly led to at least 1/4 of annual North American emissions in a year not entering the atmosphere, which is a staggering number. And so it is really true that when Indigenous people stand up for their lands, their rights, and their territory, and against fossil fuel climate destroying projects, they are putting themselves on the very front lines and benefiting everyone now and future generations. This is an alliance that must be respected and must be built and must be amplified. In fact, climate justice is not just the ethical approach. It is our best shot at really responding to the climate crisis and avoiding catastrophe. Not just because it allies us with people who are already doing the work at the most effective level, but because climate justice policies are consistently incredibly popular. And as I said, we need everyone. This is a poll from a couple years ago. This says, would you support Green New Deal policies, policies that involve transferring wealth from the wealthy to a broader society, investing in a low carbon economy, creating a green transition with job guarantees away from the fossil fuel industry? Even in this scenario, how do you feel about such a plan if it required corporations and the wealthy to pay higher taxes? 66% of Canadians in this poll were at least somewhat support. Similarly, in the United States, the Green New Deal policies pushed by politicians like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Bernie Sanders have made them, by polling, the most popular politicians in America. And I was going to share the Abby Lewis, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez film, The Decade of a Green New Deal, but I want us to have time for questions and answers. So maybe I will just pop it in the chat for people who want to view it later. It's about 7 minutes and it's a wonderful film. But we do have time to share from Abby Lewis's current campaign. And again, I am not endorsing anybody, but it is a good video that he made about what would a Green New Deal policy look like. And this is a policy that marries responding to the climate crisis in both mitigation and adaptation, but also promises to create jobs and opportunities for young people. So I'm going to, can people still see my screen? They should be seeing a Wig Standard article now. Yep, okay. So this is a 30-second video he created, just came out today.
We're still seeing the Green New Deal.
Can you see the, oh, okay, hold on. New share. There we go. Thanks, Mary. How about now?
Now,
Civilian Climate Corps?
Yep.
Good. So he's saying, what would a Civilian Climate Corps look for the riding he is in, which is West Vancouver, Sunshine Coast? This is going a little faster than I would like, but I will also share a link. So he's talking about having the government invest in small local businesses and Indigenous-led businesses that would do plastic cleanup along a waterfront. So this is responding to an environmental crisis by building Indigenous capacity, protecting ecosystems, creating job opportunities, and offering young people a chance to do meaningful work, similar to how in the original New Deal, the Civilian Corps created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration put millions of people to work repairing, and a lot of people don't know this about the original New Deal, the environmental destruction created by the initial previous 150 years of settlement, clearing the plains, building railroads, over farming, over forestation. A lot of that was enormously environmentally destructive in the United States, and the original New Deal is credited with a lot of reforestation and soil improvement, the same kinds of things that we could be doing right now. So another reason why these policies are so effective and popular, chance for everyone to read my email there for a second, is because they bring in everyone and they also address the most common criticisms. I'm going to get back to my slides here. They also address the most common criticisms that we see. So one common criticism is, we can't afford it. Green New Deal says, hey, this is how we can. The government has to lead and it has to tax the wealthiest people who bear the most responsibility for our current crisis. It says that it will kill jobs. On the contrary, says a Green New Deal policy, we are going to create new jobs, millions of new jobs in not just things like Civilian Climate Corps, but in low carbon sectors of our economy. Right? Things like healthcare, things like education, things like elder care, all things that we need more of that improve the quality of everybody's life, that provide good union jobs, and guess what, are extremely low carbon work. Speaking at the rally that I mentioned yesterday was the Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment at Queen's University, Dr. Kyla Tianahara. And I will share some of her comments right now. Okay. So Kyla said, and bless the Wig Standard for actually like publishing a big block quote from her, is awesome. Even if it is warmer, the future, it could be more equitable and more focused on the things in life that really matter. Universal childcare, universal housing, universal basic income, shorter working week. These may not sound like climate policies, but I promise you they are, because these are about changing the economy from one where a small majority holds most of the wealth and produces most of the emissions to one of private sufficiency and public luxury. This kind of economy is not just low carbon, but it's also better for the vast majority of people. And this is the Canada Research Chair in Economy and Environment, studies Green New Deal policies all over the world. She's got a blog on Green New Deal. I would encourage you to check it out. So it's not just at home that these solutions respond to the scope of the problem. Abroad, climate justice solutions will deploy the power and wealth of the West to help developing countries move off of fossil fuel fastest, become more resilient, and address global inequality. And then again, this benefits everyone. This improves global health and makes us more resilient to future pandemics. It would help address the refugee crisis that we're already experiencing and future conflict over resources. So climate justice offers us a way to deal with the problem at its source, on the scale of the problem in the most strategically effective way. And it also promises to build a better world where we live better and in a better relationship to creation. But this is a lot, right? What does this look like as individual people living our lives in Eastern Ontario? I talked about the Montreal Protocol and CFC activism. I'm bringing back another slogan from those days. I really think globally, act locally is still an amazing slogan and still a great place to start. So I've offered some examples here, but they're certainly not the only one. Number one, we're in an election. Push candidates now, anyone who comes to your door, anyone who calls you, anyone who wants your vote, push them to say, how are you advancing climate justice? And ask them to say, what is your definition of climate justice? If they don't know what climate justice is, ask them if they're willing to hear about it. Consider how climate impacts and risks are spread in your own community. Who in your community is most vulnerable to climate change? And how can you give resources to address that? I think of, for example, in our community, we are about to have a climate leadership plan. And part of that plan is retrofitting buildings. I would really like to see retrofits prioritized in seniors' homes and low-income housing, because predominantly older people are living in those spaces, and they are the most vulnerable, for example, to extreme heat, which is going to become more and more common. Another climate impact that I could see in our community that we could address through a justice focus is, why not on days of extreme weather, the kind that are going to be more and more common under climate change, why in Kingston is public transit not free? Because if people are going to get out, we need to make sure that they can do so safely. If there is a storm, if there is extreme cold, if there is extreme heat. To build on that, everybody's community just about has a community climate and emissions plan now. I would encourage you to review it and see, does it have a justice focus? Does it understand that different people in your community bear different responsibility, that different people are more vulnerable, and that addressing the climate crisis could lead to a better life for the people in your community and address a lot of the major issues that you're facing? Join a climate justice organization. In Kingston, I work with Just Recovery Kingston, which is trying to lead a recovery from the coronavirus pandemic that puts people and the planet first. 350 Kingston is also a great climate justice organization. I would also suggest joining the Anglican Green Group if you're not already involved and contributing to the work there. Welcome and support climate migrants and refugees, because in the West, just as we've experienced with the current Afghan refugee crisis, we bear an enormous responsibility for this dislocation. And it is the very least we can do to welcome people who are seeking shelter from the storm. Unfortunately, the climate crisis is a crisis of inequality. And what inequality has also led to is the popularity of people like Donald Trump, who will scapegoat immigrants and scapegoat racialized people for their own popularity. So refugees and migrants are particularly vulnerable right now and particularly in need of our alliance. And finally, talk about climate justice with friends and family. talk about how responding to climate change can be something that pushes us in a great new direction, that provides a great future for our kids and grandkids. The most impactful conversations that we have are the ones with the people closest to us. So those are some examples of some things that we could do. And I just wanted to say thank you very much. If you want to connect and reach out to me, here's some ways that you can do so. And thanks very much for the time. I've definitely got time to chat more or answer questions if you have them.
That was amazing, Jeremy. Really, really insightful and interesting and complicated. And I just wanted to say that Val Callie has added to your, she says, and advocate for basic.
Advocate for
A basic income
yes,
guarantee.
absolutely.
Yeah.
And you notice again, I mean, Val and I were both at the basic income event today, but also it was cool to see in Dr. Tanahara's quote that she mentioned universal basic income as one of those things that might not seem like a climate policy, but it is. It's also, we need everybody we can to be part of the solution. And so many people are shut out from political participation because they're working 2 or 3 jobs, or they're really poor and they're doing everything they can just to get through a week and get through a month. With a livable income guarantee, you free the creative potential of so many more people to join in the work of climate adaptation and mitigation, to join in the work of caring for the most vulnerable in our community. And so, yes, advocating for basic income is another great thing that you can do, for sure.
Absolutely. Any of the folks on the line have any questions for Jeremy or any comments?
I'm gonna stop sharing. There we go. Hello, everyone.
Oh, what do we have here?
If not, oh, okay. Andy
I'm reading
Chisholm.
Andrew's question now.
Andrew.
I'll read it out loud for everyone.
Oh,
We have
good.
a federal election coming up. For many of us concerned about climate justice, the Green Party has been a natural home politically. Sadly, the GPC seems to be imploding by self-inflicted wounds. They are polling at their lowest numbers in decades. Obviously, there is so much more to climate advocacy than putting an X beside someone on election day. Are there any good choices left, or do we hope for brighter days for national politics and focus on our efforts for advocacy and lobbying with Citizens for Public Justice and the like? It's a really good question. And I have talked to a lot of people who are like, what do we do in terms of the campaign? For sure. It is kind of bewildering in that sense, and frustrating. What I would say is that it can be tempting to give up on electoral politics because electoral politics are incredibly frustrating. But if we have, the government must lead on climate action. And so therefore it still matters. It will always matter. And I would encourage you, whatever community you're in and whatever riding you're in, to look at the climate, look at not just the party's policies and like the federal platforms, but who is running in your community. Talk to them. Can they be somebody who over the next few years can be moved, can be pushed, can be an ally on climate justice, whatever party that they are in. I would encourage you to support that person. And then after the election, hold their feet to the fire every single chance that you can get to make sure that they're actually doing the work, because we are running out of time. Yep. So sorry, my answer is both, because I know that's the answer that requires the most work, but I really think that we get the politicians that the politicians deliver what the environment we create around them delivers, right? I mean, Richard Nixon passed the Clean Air Act, and nobody's going to confuse Richard Nixon as an environmentalist, but that was a massively important environmental justice move in the United States, and he did so because there was strong constituencies around him pushing for that. Thank you. That was an excellent question. Really relevant.
Yeah, excellent. And it's hard to weigh in with this political situation and the topic of climate justice. It's like, of course, that question, we're in an election, but it's difficult to answer those questions and not, give away too much and be mindful of all the different people on the line and that you're speaking to, and that they all have different views. You did a great job there, Jeremy. You're response.
Thanks.
Any other comments or questions? I have a comment. I was listening to you saying, you know, that you're so involved in all these things, and I admire it. I would love to do that and have that time and commitment. And I find it's like, I didn't know about the rally today. I was like, why don't I know about stuff like, it's like, I guess I'm just enough in that sphere, and I wonder if other people are the same, and if more people, I drive by, to Andrew's point, I drive by in every Green Party sign, I kind of honk, or, I'm like excited, but only get it. It's like, but I see them scattered around, and I hope that people that are voting Liberal and Conservative are also climate minded, but I see the hope in those signs. But I mean, I would just like to be better connected, and I'm sure other people are the same. Even if you work full time, you only have weekends and evenings.
Yep.
Like, how do we
Absolutely.
make
Yeah, I mean that's important. I mean, and that's like the central organizer's question that I always have to ask myself, right? How do I get more people in? How do I get the people who are already in to do more? Because and how do I connect people? Because there are people who are out there who are doing stuff and they don't know about other people, and that's really important. So I'm because I am the kind of person who is so fortunate. There are very few people that are given the responsibility of working on climate justice full time. And so I am very grateful for the sisters for the resources that they put behind this work. They contribute to our community in remarkable ways. And this is another one. There are very few people like that who not only get to do the work, but are given the autonomy and trust that the sisters give me. So an enormous gratitude to them. One of the things that I try to do in terms of connecting folks is I have a newsletter, and also in terms of engaging people in ways that, it is really challenging. People have kids, people have responsibilities to elder family members, or, people have 2 jobs, people have 1 job that's really busy. People like to watch a ball game every now and then, there's a lot going on in our lives. And so number one of the things this newsletter is actually attempting to solve both of those problems. There's other ways that I do this, but I'll put that in the chat, and I encourage you to subscribe if you're interested in some of the kinds of things that are happening in the area on the climate justice front. So in the newsletter, basically, I try to offer ways for people to participate in local climate action that are, manageable, but also meaningful and also matter. And also I try to inform people about different things that are happening that different groups are doing. And so that is a way to stay more connected with what's happening. That's one answer I have for that. But yeah, that's always a struggle.
Yeah, and thinking about all the different organizations, religious, non-religious,
Yep.
350s, and if all that those people came together, there's really power in that. But there's so many different organizations that are,
yeah, that's an interesting. I honestly think that I don't necessarily think it's necessarily a weakness that there's so many different organizations working in different ways, because there are one size doesn't fit all. Different approaches and different spaces are right for different people, and different people need to be leaders in different spaces. And also, none of us knows what the solution is, right? Like, I feel like where none of us has the magic formula. We're all working away trying to see what's going to work in our community and what's going to move things forward. And so I think that it's important to work that way. But I do agree that it is important for us to be more connected and be able to support each other more and amplify what each other are doing more, and just show what a big, beautiful movement that we are. Because I think sometimes, even me as an organizer, I can get down and be like, oh, nobody else cares about this, blah, blah, blah. And then I go to something like the rally yesterday, and I see there's so many people in our community that I saw from so many different backgrounds and spaces, and coming together not just to be at a rally, but to actually make it happen and make it work and share strong messages and hold politicians accountable and start communicating with their friends. All of those things happened yesterday. And so, it definitely is, it's a challenge, but I think that's what we've got, and I think that we should just make the best of it.
I think you did a great job this evening, Jeremy, in enlightening us on climate justice and the connections many different things that, you know, we see every day. And yeah, just, it was fantastic. Thank you so much. I would just encourage everybody who's on the line that this is the second of 6 sessions. Who do we have next week? Oh, we have Lynn Silbo, who's on I can see you. Hi, Lynn. So next week, Lynn will be our guest speaker, and she'll be talking about spiritual care in the time of climate crisis, excuse me. And then we have 3 following that, 3 sessions. So again, what Jeremy said, talk to your friends and family, because it's not just us that, you know, we need to get other people that can hear this message, these really important messages that we're so fortunate to hear in these sessions. So clock, so I'm mindful of time. So I will wrap it up. I'd like to say a big thank you to Jeremy. That was really interesting. Great job. And if you're traveling, safe travels. That would be for Ian, I guess, because most of us are sitting in our houses. But okay, take care, everyone, and I hope to see you next Thursday.
Thanks, Mary. Good night, everyone.
Okay.